Ever notice how some leaders shine in a crisis but struggle with day-to-day tasks? There's a surprising reason behind this, and it's changing how we think about good leadership. Today, I have Dr. Atul Khullar. He's the medical director of Northern Alberta Sleep Clinic, an associate clinical professor of University of Alberta in the Department of Psychiatry, to join us to discuss ADHD or managing ADHD leadership. Thank you, Dr. Khullar, for joining us again.
Thank you for having me again, Andre. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Last time we talked, we had a brief discussion about how, ADHD, how do we manage our ADHD as leaders or something along those lines? And you had a lot of good points. And why did you want to talk about this particularly, this topic?
Well, I think it's important to understand because there's a lot of ADHD, mild, moderate, severe, and some of it's actually functional. And a lot of leaders, because they are so good in a crisis, probably have an element of it. And it's how to harness and manifest that to kind of make things more sort of productive overall. And I think we could all take a look at our ability to pay attention, even if we don't have ADHD, and improve our leadership style.
You said something about we do well, the ADHD brain or the ADHD leader do well in crisis. But we struggle with our everyday tasks. Why would there be a difference?
Well, because I think the everyday tasks are boring, right? They don't really induce dopamine. They're repetitive. Logistics, operations, these things. It's the things that, documentation. These are things that people with ADHD really struggle with because they're repetitive and consistent and, quite boring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can relate to that very easily. It's not really interesting anymore. It's hard to stick to it. So have you experienced this with some of your clients or patients about how this can have a negative impact on the building of a company, or how does it affect the leadership of being an ADHD leader to a team?
Well, I think there is a lot of inconsistency if you're not careful, right? And then everything becomes in crisis or done at the last minute, and the whole goals of the team can really suffer, and also you can get a lot of employee disengagement as well. And so I think there's a couple of things. The vision isn't reached. ADHD people can be very good at vision, but maybe not as good at executing it. And B, there's a real issue with sort of staff burnout, staff turnout over, and just not getting to where, the agency or company or even a family, right, could
Mm-hmm.
be.
Staff burnout and turnout. You're referring to that be from the leadership style because of the consistency, changing directions, or you said something about the vision is not reached. Is that like in a way it's not well communicated, the vision or the direction, or is it we
Or
always
getting
try to be
there.
in crisis mode?
It's a bit of a disconnect, and
Okay.
always in crisis, always, the basic things aren't done. There's always lurching, right? So, I think it's really important to understand that and to have some clear sort of systems in place because, people with a bit of ADHD that are leaders really aren't big on systems, right?
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I believe that. And those would be the systems that's not really followed by the entrepreneurial ADHD leader.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Like, and or not even in place.
For the leader.
Yeah, for the leader or even the staff. Like, it depends on how much agency the leader has, but maybe there's never even a protocol, right? And so
Hmm.
there's never even a consistency. It's just very haphazard.
Um, but in your expertise, you would recommend to have these systems in place that'd be more for the staff and the team.
Well, I think it's also having clear delegation, right?
Oh yeah.
Right? Who's doing what, how are they doing it? Some, AI tools like I see you have here can be helpful, but the
Hmm.
problem with the AI tools is sometimes they produce almost too much information.
Yeah.
You've probably seen yourself that the ADHD brain can't parse through. You get reams and reams of stuff and it isn't perfect, right? So,
Definitely overwhelm
yeah,
information
right.
overwhelm.
And I think sort of it's really looking at these aspects of what am I not going to do? What can't I do? What doesn't get done unless someone else does it?
Yeah. And like, I want to go back a little bit more to the systems, or like me and my engineering firm. I was really loved the getting the work, getting the problem solved, but the completion of the final drawings and report and the minute details, which is mundane and boring, was very hard to do. But there's no consistency on the deliveries because, one, I would come in and ask them to change to do it differently depending on the situation. It all depends. There's a lot of depends. But in the end, I created standard operating procedures, SOPs, so that they can execute those tasks consistently in a certain format that the clients were used to seeing.
Yeah.
But that kept me out of the loop. Uh, I can still do what I wanted within a certain boundaries. Like I'm saying, I didn't have a free fall because it really affects the team that if we keep having this create crisis mode, especially when you're the arsonist. A
Yeah.
long time ago, I was the arsonist putting out fires, but I was creating those fires and really confusing the team. So I like
Yeah.
the point you made about clear delegations are more critical than the actual proper systems, which can also be done with SOPs as well.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point, right? Like, and sort of making sure that there are not too many variables in the mix, right? That targets can be easily measured or monitored, or and yet there's a lot of different ways to get to those targets, but there still are the targets.
Do you think that's the default of the ADHD brain, going to not having targets and just seeing what happens day to day?
Absolutely. Yeah. Or they over focus on a bunch of targets and
Mm,
never get followed up on, right?
right. Yeah, that's a good point. Because I know definitely for a long time, I didn't have a lot of measurable targets. I just had a general idea what I wanted, but it was definitely a free for all every time, which I know I lost a lot of good staff in the past. So this is
And,
making a lot of sense to me than what you're talking about.
and I think the other thing is you can't over operationalize it because then you check out too, right? It's the fine balance of sitting down with your team or yourself and figuring out what's it like, what's an actual meaningful target. And I
Okay.
think sometimes that gets missed, especially in bigger companies. And I think that's it isn't just a matter of delegating everything or, creating targets, not specifically, because that's sometimes what can happen with the ADHD leader. It's really, really having the focus on what's important.
Focus on what's important. That's very simple. Okay. All right. I want to come back. Use the term important, but in my brain, a lot of times what's important is not really interesting.
Exactly.
So how
Right.
can I change that? Like important in what context? To direction of the team, the vision.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's blending it. And this is where
Okay.
delegating or working together with somebody who might be a little more operations or protocol minded would be useful, right? Like, creating sort of a shared vision.
Okay. So let's go more about that. So that's the kind of like having the right hand person or support team in place.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Or even a group of people, right? That can check the idea and be like, because like a lot of, people that ADHD brains have great ideas, they're just not terribly practical, right?
Yeah, that's a common entrepreneur, especially a visionary entrepreneur
Right.
default. Yep.
It's to dial it down and to, without suppressing it, what can be done.
Okay. So in my experience, I'm finding it very difficult to find the right people to be on my support team or on my team. Because one of being driven, high achieving, growth
Yep.
mindset. I got one speed, which is all out. It's very
Yeah.
tough for me to slow down. Being visionary, doing what most, in the engineering world, I'm a non-traditional engineer in a traditional setting.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to find people that can either keep up or actually put up with that kind of thinking and direction. I don't want to say it's just, ADHD or neurodiverse versus neurotypicals, but a lot of neurotypicals are on the team. and it's very disruptive just how we think and do things. So how can we make that work with a support team? Does it take a special person, different way we structure things?
Well, sure, it definitely does, but obviously, HR is probably the biggest problem of anything. But I think again, this is where stuff like SOP can help, right? Here's the procedure, here's this, this is the deliverable. So it's almost like you can translate the idea into that, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
have 19 different ideas, right? But there's a clear sort of pathway for the other people to follow, right? And really working on and continuing to refine those processes, right?
Yeah.
And kind of and to check what's working and not working. Don't just put something in there and leave it or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I want to go back to this right-hand person. It's more of an operations thing. Because you said something earlier about it's a challenge of execution more than deriving ideas or doing
Yeah.
things. So the right-hand person, you says operations. Why did you use the term execution earlier?
Well, because the ADHD brain has a ton of ideas but never gets anything done, right?
Mm-hmm.
They kind of bounce around eight times, or with eight different ideas, but nothing ever kind of gets finished. That's a classic ADHD sign, right? Start a bunch of stuff and don't finish.
Yeah.
So I think there's 2 points to that. One is this worth starting? And B, let's finish it, right? And this is where I think the team would come in or the procedure would come in.
So the strength is coming up with the ideas or alternate paths, new ideas, but forgetting to execute, or actually, it's probably that ADHD inertia to get them executed.
Yep.
Um, that's a whole strength on its own to be able to generate that. But in a way, our weakness is the execution, which we're not saying it's a fault. It's just the way it is, where we
Yeah.
need, like I always say, hide your weaknesses. So if my weakness is execution
Yeah.
or idea uh, clarification, having that team member to help you with that side that they're strong at
Yeah.
and they enjoy the mundane, boring stuff that
Yeah.
our brain has a hard time engaging.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's very key. So it really comes down to having the right team around you, especially when I'm hearing that not secondhand person, but your right hand person and that person also has to be able to handle the inconsistency.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think, there's a certain type but there's ways to kind of limit the inconsistency, right? And I think, ADHD people don't tend to be great at consistently meeting, but consistent meeting is one way to kind of get this going.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I got my admin to force the meetings on me. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm using those terms because that's the way my brain sees it. But that consistency, they get the information, but we got stone appointments that just consistently go with a certain point. Um, no, this makes a lot of sense to me. And it's challenging. Like you said, HR is very challenging, especially nowadays in 2025. It's definitely changed since the COVID. So, having that said, so if my strength is being the entrepreneur, the visionary, seeing where we can go, the rough solution to the problem, then having a support team to execute it. It's what I'm finding with ADHD is more about mental energy management. I
Yeah.
think a lot of times I can really go off like a Ferrari car, it's high performance,
Yeah.
but yet at the other times, if I'm doing these mundane tasks, it's like a out of tune diesel engine pumping black smoke all the
Mhm.
time, just wasting energy.
Mhm.
And then the challenge too is slowing down for the team. What I mean by slowing down is just the intensity that a lot of us entrepreneurs have is one speed all out, but
Yeah.
sometimes we do have to slow down and stop. And how can we manage our energy to do that?
Well, and I think this is where proper treatment is important, right? Like, it's really the ADHD treatment, it's whether you are doing some sort of life coaching or the medications may need be needing tweaking, these sorts of things. I hear a lot of is the stimulant doesn't last long enough, and anything after 2:30 doesn't get done, right?
Mhm.
For example, right, to give one example, or it isn't optimal, right? And the second chunk of that is, because it's pills and skills, right? Is
Yep.
what skills are the pills giving you, right? I guess, and what are you doing with that energy or the focus that the pills are giving you? Because often what I see is people get treated with ADHD, and they're better, but then it's the higher level stuff. They can execute, but it's really the prioritization. And prioritization uh, is not something that I find really changes with medication.
Prioritization requires us to determine what's important, more important than
Yeah.
the other.
Yeah. And obviously you have to have the brain clearer to do that. And so I
Mhm.
think, meds are a chunk of this, but I don't find the prioritization often gets better. More work gets done, right?
Oh, lots gets done, but
Yeah,
necessarily the right
right.
stuff.
But it may be in circles.
Yeah.
And so really focusing.
Bless you.
Sorry. Yeah, but it's really, really drawing it back to core principles.
Oh,
What
tell
is
me more.
what is the vision of the business? What is the goal? You can't be everything to everyone, right? These are things that people with ADHD struggle with, right? Even normal people struggle with it. Um, you know, really focusing on what are you delivering in that particular, you know, arena.
Yeah.
Like you
So that's
can't,
just reminding ourselves the
yeah,
direction.
yeah, you can't take on all the projects. You have to have a real sense of what you are,
Hmm.
right? So I'll give you an example. When as Steve Jobs was creating the iPhone, he would have meetings, right? And he would meetings, and people would be wandering away, this, that, the other, and he would hold this up and go, or the phone up anyway. Sorry, we're audio,
Yeah.
and go, how does this relate to this? Tell me how this relates to this. The vision was the box, the phone,
Right.
right? So you need those people to repeatedly keep because the vision on track. Because the ADHD patient vision, say entrepreneur, sometimes the vision wanders. Oh, I can do this, and I can do this, and I can do that. I'm like, well, no,
It's interesting. Something new.
right?
Let's
Like, yeah,
go for it.
exactly, right? Like, it's just like, so it's just ends up being a bunch of half-finished projects.
Yeah, I'm guilty. Guilty. Yeah. Is anything that's my problem is always, yeah, I can solve it. Sure, I can try or I can do, but it's not within our core focus, which I think is a very great point to have. Um, I also got a note here about balancing hyperfocus and overwhelm. So since our brains take everything in and doesn't really has a function to filter a bunch of stuff out, the ADHD brain really gets into overwhelm frequently. How can a team help prevent that or slow it down, the
Well, and
overwhelm?
I think it's some of the same things we talked about. It's keeping the vision consistent, keeping, this is a project, like have a stepwise sort of thing. This is happening, then this is happening, then this is happening, right? Um, and really kind of breaking things down into bite-sized pieces. And this is something that ADHD people aren't necessarily great at. So part of that support or team or whatever is to break the chunk down into bite-sized pieces.
Oh, for the team to execute.
Yeah. Like, someone needs to translate that almost, right? There'll be a
Yeah.
bunch of ideas, but they need to be translated into bite-sized chunks that can be executed, even for the entrepreneur themselves.
Actually, you're right. And for the entrepreneur themselves, even though we think we don't need it.
Yeah.
Because I got a friend actually, he's told all the time, the lily pads have to be closer. Bring the lily pads closer.
Yeah.
So that's what you're referring to. So that's really good. Um, what is so leadership? I don't think there's one way to define leadership. I think everyone's got their unique way of doing it. What would be your recommendation as an ADHD leader? What should we see, consider or keep core to our direction as a leader for our team?
I think, are they hearing it, checking in with them? Is it actually, being, what do you need to be executed? Um, you know, prioritization, right? Finding ways to reduce decision fatigue, I think is important. People with ADHD have a lot of trouble grocery shopping,
Yep.
right? Sometimes, for example, but if they order them online, it's a little bit easier.
Less decisions, less
Yeah.
overwhelm.
Yeah. Really formalize the decision matrix. And that comes from a clear vision and clear executable objectives.
So you're just telling us that we got to be a lot more clear for everyone.
Yeah. And it's almost like a translation, like,
Yeah.
or asking yourself, are my thoughts clear?
No, that makes a lot of sense because it makes sense to our brain, but not to everyone else's.
Yeah.
And no matter what kind of brain type that you are, we always assume everyone understands what's going on in our heads or that
Yeah.
they hear what we're saying in our heads. So it's not just an ADHD challenge for that, but definitely as an entrepreneur as well.
Well, and I think the other thing, one thing that someone at ADHD told me very clearly that I never forgot was, well, that's the first time I've heard it too,
Yeah,
when it comes out of their mouth. So, I really think channeling the impulsivity, right?
that's yeah. And the thing, channeling the impulsivity, but also being careful who is around that impulsivity as well during those times.
Note applications on the phone, writing stuff out, and then maybe
Yeah.
looking at those sea of notes, that sort of thing, just to kind of, get the thoughts out and then start to curate them. They need to be curated in a way. So,
No, that makes a lot of sense. The curation is very. I got to write that down and follow that because the other thing too, I have. We were talking with one guest a long time ago. I think it was season 2. Vision bombing. One of the problems that entrepreneurs have with their team is vision bombing,
yep,
is sharing that idea with everyone all the time.
yep,
And usually by the end we finish our bombing run, we like, oh, those aren't good ideas. We walk away, but then the team acts on it because we
yep.
just bombed it. And at the same time, it scares the crap out of them that we're making another change as well.
And that's a great point. So the vision bombing needs to be done internally,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's an important point.
Nice. So following our core principles is key to success, but also key to consistency because we are very good at inconsistency because that way we create a lot of crisis, which our brain enjoys. And
Yeah.
then clear delegations seems to be more critical than proper systems.
Yeah.
And
So
I really,
I'll
yep.
give you an example. Like let's say, okay, there's two types of brains, right? Well, not two types, but the point is sometimes people want to reduce the decision and they just eat in the hotel restaurant, right?
Mhm.
It's done, it's easy, that sort of thing. But another type of person would be, well, I should go look at this and look at that, and look at that, and look at that. And it's understanding what can be done at that certain time, right? So, for example, I can't stand hotel restaurants, right? But sometimes that's just the most expedient way for the time I have,
Mhm.
right? But it's switching set, right? How much time do I have? What's the situation? People with ADHD sometimes get so intensely focused they don't switch set.
That's because it is not enough transition time or not enough of a
Yeah, or
transition.
they don't have a clock in their head,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, right. And I'll use a sports analogy. If a quarterback has ADHD, he usually gets sacked, right? Because he doesn't know when to get rid of the ball, right?
Too many
Right.
options.
Yeah, too many options and doesn't know how much time he's got,
Yeah.
right?
The
This is
time
why the people
blindness.
are often late or they miss appointments or
Yeah.
barely make trains. There's just no sense of how long stuff takes. And I think that would be one thing I would really strongly communicate to anyone who's got some ADHD and is an entrepreneur. Understand how long stuff takes, you know, for you, for your team, and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, many times I think it's a 2 hour job, but it's actually a 2 day job.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that
Yeah.
really disengages the team. It creates crisis. And is that 2 hour job that you think is even worth doing?
That's a very good question. And I'm starting to assess that now as the project requests are coming in.
Yeah, that's the first step is like, is this worth doing before you even get there, right? Because like you said, the ADHD brain's like new, exciting, different. They see sort of that this could work in some fashion and it's just not going to work, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the whole prioritization. We have a challenge with that because we have a hard time deciding what's more important than the other because everything seems to be equally important, is the way I see it. So excellent. Well, thanks again, Dr. Khullar, for joining us on this. A lot of great insights. Like I said, you know, returning and following our core principles is the key to success. Right hand people who are there to support your weaknesses, which is more on the execution side of the vision. And I'm guilty. That's definitely key to have on the team. And then, we love and thrive on inconsistency and crisis, but not everyone does, and not all the projects get done on time. So, Dr. Khullar, thanks again for joining us. Where can people find you?
They can find me at medsleep.com. That's kind of my sleep clinic, Edmonton at medsleep.com.
Thank you. And for you, the listeners, what's a problem quirk that you have that's disrupting your team? Or what did you take from today that you will change your leadership style? Because we can all be strong leaders. It's not about fixing our flaws. It's more about using our strengths and hiring people to support our weaknesses. So thanks again to the listeners for learning with me. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, André. Always good to be here.
Always a pleasure, sir. Hope you come back soon. Take care.
Bye.